sensiLab. So hopefully this is the beginning of conversation and collaboration to follow, and hopefully that becomes really clear and evident as the presentation unfolds. So next slide. A little bit about me. I actually have a bit of a systems development background, working at University of Melbourne in the Australian Science Archives project and its predecessors that eventually became the East Scholarship Research Centre. Did my PhD here as part of the Clever Record Keeping Metadata project, and then became a lecturer in 2011, and so now a future fellow. I guess the point about that is to say, yes, I do have a good development background, and the systems that I actually developed over that time are in use in a variety of different archival contexts. Still, yes, and Liz can attest that as a user. Yeah.
To stress that it's not just used in Australia.
Yeah. So yes, so I do have the development background, but have moved into this research space. So next slide, please. Now, I'm sure you're aware there's a Royal Commission on at the moment into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. I guess my question is, for us in the archives and record keeping community, that's kind of there's a big deal about that. So does that surprise you that archivists and records managers are feeling that this is a big moment for our profession?
Yes. Remembering.
Yes. I guess, yeah, because I guess my question is to the audience is whether you can, does it naturally come into your mind the connection between archives and records and this kind of issue, this kind of process? It's like...
Yes. Not just for me, but
yeah.
maybe.
Is anybody going, what is the connection? I guess that's the moment I'm looking for.
Presumably it's all come up because of what people remembered and what's been or not recorded. Yeah?
That's right, yes. It is about, I mean, I'm sure if you've been listening to the news, like just last week, there was talk about destruction of records where I think it was the Jehovah's Witnesses actually made conscious decisions to destroy records that related to instances of child abuse. So yes, so the records issues are there. They're to do with how you do have good record keeping systems to act as instruments of accountability in organisations where there's the potential for abuse to happen. And it's also to do with the stories that we're constantly being told about when people later in life try to get access to their records. That can be quite re-traumatising as well too, because of the barriers that get put up to providing access. So there's sort of two issues at play. The fact that making sure that you create good quality records in the first place, and then the issue of through time when people want to access those, that you have frameworks that can allow for that. So next slide. Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like it's about what are the rights of ownership and custody and access. It's like it's a complex mix. So yes, very good. Yeah. So yes, it's and what this commission is, it's we actually have known this for a while. These issues have been raised through a series of different kinds of inquiries, which have really highlighted these kind of issues around rights to access records, who owns them, who makes decisions about whether they're how long they're kept for, who keeps them, who has access to them. So, and there's been a series of inquiries into communities who are facing identity, memory and accountability crises, where these sort of issues about records and access to records have been raised over and over again. So if we go for the next slide, the Bringing Them Home report, which was the report into stolen children, the stolen generations, Indigenous children forcibly removed from their families, made some key recommendations about records and archives, and behind it had these three objectives. I guess the first one just reiterates the importance of records about family and community linkages, that they must be preserved and I guess must also be created in the first place if you're thinking about the now. And it's this line, the second, access to records must be made easier and less hurtful. The fact that the access frameworks that we have created hurt people. They actually re-traumatise them. Come in. They actually cause pain. They're not, they're kind of constructed around the organisation's needs, not the person's needs. And in this case, when it comes to Indigenous communities, it's also being culturally respectful as well too. And then the third one, which was then and is still now quite a radical proposition, is to say that communities should actually have an opportunity to manage their own documentation in terms of ownership. Who does actually own these records through time? Is it with the organisation who created them, or actually is there a need to think about transferring that through time? So that was 1997. If we go to the next slide, we have a little example of the Care Leaver Australia Network, CLAN, which is an self-advocacy group set up for people who've been in out-of-home care. And they did a survey in 2011 to ask people what happened when their experiences in accessing their records. And as you can see, it's a bit dismal. 40% of respondents found that there was no records about them, and that, as well as the presence of records causing concern because of what's written in them, the absence of records can also cause concern, because here's someone who's been in an institution for a long period of their childhood and there's just nothing to show for it. It's like, was I that worthless? Long response times, frustration, dissatisfaction, anger, disappointment, shock at what records contained, the missing information, withheld information, errors, and again, the way also in this survey they talked about how those records did actually impact throughout their lives in all sorts of ways, contributing to that ongoing discrimination and disadvantage. So if we go to the next slide, another little snapshot. In 2012 there was a Victorian Ombudsman investigation, which is actually, this is the lowlights from the report rather than the highlights, sort of saying that we're not doing very well in managing these records because most of them are uninspected, unindexed, unscanned, can never be contacted. The department can't be confident that they've actually got all the records relating to an individual when they ask for it, hence those long delay times. And the one that really gets me is that the Ombudsman found that when there has been projects to kind of address the issues, they've kind of made things worse. So that last one there, that it's actually complicated the situation rather than resolving it. So that's kind of a bit damning. Yeah. So if we move on to the next slide, I think it's a design problem because our systems have been designed for a different time, a different kind of user, and this has been recognised with this quote here to sort of say when this kind of user is approaching the archive, they're not the sort of academic research user that our frameworks have been constructed around, but they're actually someone who is actually looking for themselves in the record. And I think this quote sort of talks about how they're a stranger to the archive because they're just not used to the sort of the coding and the bureaucratic rhetoric. The levels when it comes to people who've been in a care situation, it does have impact on literacy levels, and yet all the frameworks we've created seem to reinforce a bureaucratic rhetoric which is alienating for them, and in some cases we're actually asking them to go back to the same system which has caused them their problems in the first place as well too. So, and the final one there, that they're actually, when they do ask, they find that they're actually not in the archive because our processes illustrations of what happened to them. So this kind of use and user and use of archives, I don't think we haven't designed it for, and I don't think we can just tack that onto our existing frameworks. So if we go to the next slide, I'm actually going to stop talking for a bit and let a couple of care leaders talk about their experiences and tell us what they want from the systems. So if we can flip to the video.
And that's what I think a good record ought to be. It ought to be a story that helps the person, if they're 30, 40, 50 years old, to look back on their child and say, oh yeah, that's what happened. I understand. This is the way things, I understand where my parents were and where my siblings were. I understand why I was in care. I can cope with that.
My records are really important to me because they meant that I could find out who I was. I was really lost when I left care. Accessing my records meant that I found out who I was and really had a sense of belonging of where I was in society and what I was doing at certain times in my life.
Well, in care, particularly at the Ballarat Orphanage, when we were old enough to have discussions, there were never any discussions about why we were there and what the plan was and so on. So I'd gone through my whole adult life raising my own children, not knowing the story, and it's just, you feel a bit of a goose not being able to tell your children why you grew up in care when they knew my parents, who seemed to them to be perfectly fine, normal people. The files themselves didn't contain the full story by any means, not only because they were patchy and there were obviously big gaps of information that weren't kept, but also because there were whiteouts, there was censorship. The only letter my mother ever wrote to me, from day one, there was always a paragraph whited out, which I was never allowed to see until about 2 years ago. I'm talking about 2009, when I was able finally to, some kind soul procured a copy of that letter, and I thought, I'm going to find out something really, really important. And it was just nonsense. It was just something about my brother which we'd already known about.
I don't like the blanking out in my record because I believe it's all a part of my life and a part of who I was and where I grew up and everything like that, and I don't see any real reason of why things needed to be blanked out, especially, you know, okay, there were traumatising events that happened, but they're the things that I remember when I was in care. So why blank those bits out? Why not have extra bits in there of me, you know, cooking, or me, photos of me at school, or my school reports and things like that?
I never thought I would get angry, but I went through the stage of just feeling sheer anger. Why can a public servant see that letter and I, who's the subject of the letter, can't I see it?
There was my year 7 school photo, but that was the only photo in the whole records that I had. It was really difficult for me because not having that and knowing, you know, a normal biological child has that, and it made me feel really singled out as to, because I grew up in care, I wasn't allowed to have photos, or I didn't have any photos, and a lot of my friends didn't know that I had a care experience. But after my birthday, I had to sort of explain to them that I was in care, and that's why I don't have the photos.
Identity, just straight identity things, birth certificates and the like, really critical. You shouldn't have to be scrabbling around for that, as some of our members still do. It's because sometimes they change their names and they don't know what their real name is. They go to the birth, deaths and marriages certificate. They've got to really tell a long, convoluted story, and finally might be lucky and get a birth certificate.
Like when I had children, it's going to be really hard to show them my past and my records, or, you know, when they ask the questions of, you know, what did you look like at 15, 16? I don't even have a photo to show my own children.
one of the things that I think should happen now that didn't happen in my day was the child actually being involved in the discussion about what's going to be recorded and what's going to be kept and so on. For me, age 55 or whatever it was, all of this was a total shock, you know, to even see that there were files. But I was never involved in any of the processing of that material. The stuff that I saw, I've seen for the first time, you know, conceptually as well as practically.
For me, I think the best way for me to have had the best records that I could have had was for me to have a voice in my records through, you know, planning what I wanted in my records, through taking photos, you know, of myself at birthdays and things like that, so that I had all that when I left care. It would have been ideal. I just would have liked to have had some input in a story that's going to be written about me.
Okay, so I guess for me, the first time I kind of heard about, in this case, Frank Golding's experience of accessing his records, it was a real turning point, because it made me really question whether those archival systems that I am proud to have developed are actually part of the problem, in that they add to the layers of bureaucracy rather than taking them away, and whether they actually help to deliver the requirements that Frank and Samantha are talking about for record keeping, archives and record keeping in this space. So I guess that was the foundation which led through, if we go on to the next slide, to the Future Fellowship application, to say, well, we have the experts the experts in their own experience telling us what they want from our archives and record keeping systems. How can we go about delivering that? And for me, it is a design question. It's like, how do we have to, we can't just tack this kind of stuff onto our existing frameworks, because they haven't been designed with those things in mind. So how do we actually develop a design methodology that is participatory and inclusive, and actually taking into account multiple rights in records? So that's the objectives of the Future Fellowship. And if we go to the next slide, I guess I'm picking up on the sort of movement, the design as being a problem-solving technique, or problem discovery. You're actually discovering exactly what the problem is through the designing processes. So certainly in the sort of community urban development space, there's a lot of design thinking opportunity, design thinking talk going on. And if we go to the next slide, yeah, picking up on some of the design thinking of people. I assume there's a few nods that people have talked about that, where you actually do want to, in the design thinking, really get to know what the problem is, to really to share those experiences, so that you're not designing for someone, you're designing with someone. You're really trying to establish that empathy and that joint ownership and understanding of what the problems are, to be able to creatively explore that, to not be constrained by what the existing systems, so that you can actually throw ideas out, and so again with that attitude of saying you want to transform rather than just add a little bit onto the existing system. So design thinking, and then the whole notion of co-design, the fact that you actually, people like Frank and Samantha tell you quite clearly what their needs are, and so how do you work with them to design a system that will work for them. So if we go to the next slide, so wanting to get this shift from designing for communities. I mean, in the archives and record keeping space, we do. I think we do have the best intentions of trying to design for our users, but we are designing for them. We're saying, here you go, here's a system, usability test it, or use it. It's not actually designing with them. So this is what I'd like to shift our inspiration for thinking about, and perhaps even to go further and saying here's the framework and the community members to do the design. So if we go to the next slide, I've been informed by value-sensitive design. Has anyone come across that in their travels? Where it's actually saying, let's actually think about the values that we're embedding in technology, in technological systems. Let's actually ask ourselves questions about what those values are, really surface them, don't just make assumptions about them. And they have a framework of saying conceptual, empirical and technical investigations. And so if we go to the next slide, that sort of helped me to sort of put together what the research program is going to involve. We're taking some concepts and ideas. Some of these are archives and records ones. So, and then how that's going to play out is to actually do some scoping work in these initial boxes here, leading into some co-design workshops to take on aspects of these two design projects. One, to think about how, I guess in that video, the sort of frank kind of user where someone's coming later in life to want to discover and reconstruct their identity and memory from records that are existing, and then also to think about how we actually pick up on what Samantha said and make sure that we have quality records being created for children that are currently in care, that they are representative of more than just the official and officious view of their time. So yeah, so probably if we flip through to the last one, I think the next one. So yes, so I'm interested in kind of exploring the sort of co-design, the way that you go about doing this in all sorts of fun and interesting ways of designing. So I'm hoping that might be something that the sensiLab might be interested in helping me explore, where you actually bring people together and you have the butcher's paper and the sticky notes, you have the kind of things that you can see around the office here, and actually play out and play around with ideas. If we go to the next slide, because this is the view that we have of our archives at the moment, bound up in red tape, fortresses, silos, and if we go to the next slide, I actually want them to be these open network worlds. So that's what I'm looking to design. But I do need help because it's a big program. So that's why I'm really keen to present here and to start those conversations about how we might, how our research interests might connect to do that. So.
So I guess maybe now we sort of move into a discussion
Yes,
phase.
I was keen to get to that as quickly as possible.
Yeah, no, that's great. I don't know if you want to sit down. You don't have to
Yes,
stand.
that would be good. Yes, thank you.
Do those work?
Just be careful. Yeah.
Oh, that's fine. No, that's cool. That's nice. That has movement.
So maybe just to kick things off, like, can you paint us a picture of how you imagine a really successful version of what you're talking about would possibly work? What it would be like?
Oh gosh, good question. Yes. Well, I guess it's an example. Okay.
Yes.
Within
Not the definitive example necessarily, but just something that just illustrates the.
I guess in thinking about existing finding aids to records, they're incredibly textual documents. Sometimes they get put up as databases, web pages, but essentially they're written documents that are describing the context of the records and then sort of cataloguing them. And they're written from the perspective of the organisation. Here's the records that we have created to fulfil our organisational functions. So I thought, when I was in New York a few weeks ago, was being on the subway and learning a new system and a complicated network system, all these different train lines, expresses, stopping all stations, and having a map and having signs at the station and sort of trying to navigate my way through that, and thinking, how would it be if we actually presented archival access frameworks as a subway map from a user, I want to get from here to here, then what's the pathway that I might follow, as opposed to it being documented from that organisation perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of turning things around, making it more, use and user-centred. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
So that's the sort of, that's one idea.
Is
It's
there
like,
enough similarity between systems though to allow, are we talking trains and trains, or are we talking about trains and buses? So, you know, like,
there should be, that's the thing. It's
Okay.
like, that's a great question, because that's one of the problems, is that in the archive world we build silos. When it comes to records, they're networked, and so we should actually be building networked open systems. So that's one of those challenges, is to actually shift the start of the process from saying I'm going to build a thing that documents my collection, to how am I going to be a node in a network and make my stuff interoperable. And I guess I have Greg Rowland as a PhD student who's kind of exploring that aspect of things.
So I know Greg is doing work in there.
Yes.
Do you feel you need to solve some problems in there before you can get to other bits, or do you want to attack it from all these different ways and then just kind of see?
Yeah, well, I guess, I've sort of I think given the timing, that's what we have to do. It's like, I think there's certainly pieces of the puzzle, and just doing some planning earlier with Sue and sort of thinking through those co-design workshops. There's 3 years of that, and how that might progress from the first year being actually just exploring the co-design process. So what are some little design projects you could take on that you could actually explore how you actually do this with the people who are interested in being part of this, then move on to saying, okay, what does that archive of child for the lifetime look like? What are some of the key components of that? And then perhaps the final year being, well, actually how you're evaluating and promulgating that, communicating that to other people. So thinking about how it plays out in that way. So yes.
Ask a question.
Yes.
Sort of coming from two perspectives. One, kind of my ignorance and being on the side of the archival science as such. There is a difference between record, formal record, and other things that these two people we are talking about in terms of their life story. Is it true?
They're all records.
Then I don't know whether you've been following, there is a kind of movement started from Microsoft. I have to check it, something about life stories, where the guy diligently scans everything that he comes across. His dockets from supermarket, anything.
Oh yes, that sort of
Mm.
So
document,
is it what you are kind of advocating for?
No, because that's for some people that might be a really nice way to live their life, but for other people then they don't want to keep those records. But you need to create, and you don't want a time in care to be overly surveilled in that kind of way. So, but you're actually, what you want to do with a co-designed and then a co-created archive system is allow a child who's in a care situation to be able to be involved in putting records into their archive.
That's what I wanted to ask. Are you creating something that's like a snapshot that doesn't change, or is it something that can evolve?
No, it has. That's the thing. It's like it has to evolve, and in some ways it has to continue to evolve once they've left care as well too. Like your own family archive does. It's like that. It's both the object, but it's actually about the processes that you go through in accessing it and telling stories about the things, bringing them out at certain times. I think Samantha was probably alluding to an 18th or a 21st birthday when she had no records. Her her friends were expecting to see that sort of family story, and yet there's nothing there because of that blankness from her time in care.
And then you're sort of getting into issues of what's the definitive true record, and what's interpreted, and but how do you
Yes.
how do you
It has to be quality
establish
too,
the
because
provenance of information?
And again, that's a relative. That's like from whose perspective is it true and authentic, and yeah, yes, it's not easy. It's very complex, and it's long term as well, and that so it's going to be shifting and changing as to what people
There
need
have
from
to
it.
be like a time dimension to records to show how they
Yes,
changed over time.
Yes, yeah. And that's one of the
Quite
challenges we have with dealing with electronic records is how we do that, because in paper you can see variations because people annotate them, they white out, and you've got those physical traces, and that's been one of the challenges is how do you build, when you do that electronically, you have to consciously build that record keeping into the systems.
Yeah, that's an interesting
Yes.
aspect of it.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm just thinking about that. The examples you've been giving have been giving to us have been of organisations that have been using records to ultimately control or marginalise people. So what in the process that you're talking about will be able to stop those organisational structures trying to impede? I would have, if I
That's
was
part of the
running
design.
any of these sorts
Yeah.
of organisations, I'd find this very
Yes.
threatening, I would think.
Yes.
You might be able to co-opt it in some way, but
I guess that's where it becomes a real design challenge, because it's actually it's taking away those. It's saying to an organisation, you're a node in a network. You're not deciding what the requirements are. You participate in providing care for a child, then your duty of care to that child is to contribute records to their archive, and you don't prescribe what that archive is, but here's the technological framework, here's the policy framework, here's the guidance as to what records you must provide, how you must support the child's record keeping. There's a whole lot of issues around record keeping literacy, which I've got another PhD student exploring. So it changes the organisation's power en masse. And yes, I think it is the Who Am I project that video came from. I've got to get my dates right. I think it finished in 2012. Yeah, yes. So, and that made some recommendations about social work practice, but apparently there hasn't been much uptake of it. So there's a real need to have a look at that and ask questions as to, is it because in the social work system they'd love to be able to do that, but the systems they've currently got don't give them the opportunity to do that. They're prescribed around the organisation's bureaucratic needs, and so don't give them any scope to do it, whereas the workers would love to be able to have a framework in which they could be helping a child to add those other records to that picture, to their file. Yes.
Joanne,
Yes.
could you just elaborate a little bit on the kind of narrative of those, say those people in the videos, what would they have to have gone through to search for their records? Would they have started off making phone calls and then waited for a response? Or would they, if there's some parts they can access online with special permissions, like do they have to contact solicitors? For just like a general example of someone, if they're searching back through and they're going to paper archives, do they get access to those archives and then just get let loose in kind of corridors and boxes, or does someone go and bring stuff to them and say, you sort it out? Or what kind of things happen?
It happens through the freedom of information, is how people ask to get access to their personal, because I guess the freedom of information has kind of two dimensions. It's to deal with how you get access to records relating to you, as well as the general information for accountability. So essentially they have to go through the motion of a freedom
Is there a time limit on in that? You know, ASIO is releasing stuff that it's following citizens in the 50s and 60s or so.
Yeah, well, I guess that's where, again, that's where our frameworks, the archives and records frameworks, have actually disposed of records. So someone can put in a freedom of information request, and they might get back the response that those records have been, we don't have any records because they've been destroyed.
Yeah.
I think there's been a shift. I was reading an article from a UK perspective which said that whereas in the past those records would have been destroyed, 5 years after the child has left care, now there's an understanding that these records have impact and that they actually need to be kept for the lifetime of an expected lifetime, so 75 years.
Yeah.
So I think for people like of Frank's generation, so many records have just been destroyed that they get the response there's nothing there.
Yeah.
And then the problem that you get is the response that it's going to take forever for us to find stuff about you. So, and there's another, I think there's an Auditor General's report about freedom of information where they were actually getting the applicant to sign away the need to report within the 30 to 45 days. Otherwise, they were going to start charging them. Whereas it's quite the Auditor General said no. In this case, there's no charge for accessing these records, and should never be charged. So they were kind of using the system to sort of get around their reporting obligations, so that it wasn't being highlighted that it was taking months and months.
But would the physical archives often be distributed in various places, various homes, various warehouses?
Yes. I see Liz wanting to jump in there.
I worked on the project that came after that and heard some not so nice stories from people who'd done things like travelled hours and hours and hours to get to a place where they'd received care, only to find out that the records weren't held there, or that they needed to make a booking, or that they needed ID. And if you need ID to get your ID, you're in a real bind, you're around in circles. A lot of these institutions have closed down, or they've merged with other organisations, so the records may have been shipped off to who knows where, and often the people working there don't even know. So even just finding the person to give the FOI request to, let alone knowing how to go through, I don't know if anyone here has ever put in an FOI request, but it's quite a technical process. It's not something you can just do over a cup of tea. So it becomes really complicated, and even for the archivists working on the project, all of the time it was really difficult for us to find out what records existed and what was there and what people would need to do to gain access to them.
So sometimes if they say they've been destroyed, they might not have been destroyed,
They
but
might
who knows
not have
where
been
they are.
created in the first place. You just don't know.
No, that issue of going, there's actually advice to, Clan gives advice to say try again in a couple of years' time and you might get a different answer, which is, again, that Ombudsman report I think really highlighted that issue. So
there's also, because of the long advocacy that's occurred before there's even been a recognition in society of the abuse that's occurred and how widespread it's been, there's been a long period of time when the people responsible for the abuse and the institutions they work for that have been complicit in covering up that abuse.
Actively destroying records.
Deliberately taken action to ensure that records are not available because they in many cases would provide evidence
Yeah, they'd be implicated.
in various ways of the abuse, because one of the reasons, strong identity reasons that were covered by Frank and Samantha in that clip, that many people are trying to find evidence against the perpetrators of the abuse, but the systemic problems are with the institutions that have covered up that abuse. And I guess the issue for us as archivists, or as activist radical archivists, is that we see major systemic problems within the archives as well that need to be addressed. It's not just a matter of projects to index the records of the past, etc. If it's not going to keep on recurring, it's happening right now with kids in detention. Okay,
okay, proper records aren't being kept in 15, 20, 30 years' time, if those kids finally get recognised and become Australian resident citizens, they'll be looking for their records and trying to find out what happened to them and why it happened to them, and it's just going to keep on going. And unfortunately, the nature of human society, we're not going to solve this problem absolutely, but radical archivists, radical social workers, the lawyers that work with them, the teachers that work with the children want better solutions to this stuff.
Want solutions that have the
Joanne's
capacity to
co-design work will be with all of those people, and radical technologists is what we're looking for, to work with us, the kind of technologists who don't embed in systems the values often of the institutions and systems that are actually perpetrating the problems. Sorry, that's one of my hobby courses.
No, it's very interesting.
Yes. So yes, the call out is for radical designers, radical programmers, radical.
So maybe just on that, the issue of co-design, because of course we want to look at ways in which maybe we can help you or work with you. How would you see that process as working, and what do you need that you don't currently have?
Design flair. It's like one of the things I've sort of realised in looking at the design stuff is just how nice it looks, and so it's having that ability to kind of communicate the communication design aspects of things is one area that I'm really conscious of needing help with, I guess, and then then turning that into the programming and prototyping. Some good programmers and prototyping are interested in doing things in creative, radical ways as well too. So I know that's definitely two areas in the technological space. And then I'm hoping that those workshops would be of interest from people exploring that from a research perspective as well too, that it's an opportunity. I've got my archives and records questions, but there's design questions that can actually be addressed in that process as well. We're also, thinking about artistic ways you can work with records as part of memory construction, narrative therapy, that sort of being able to have control over how records get represented. We were at the Archival Educators and Research Institute conference, and there was a great presentation about an activism archive, an archive which is a surveillance archive about activists from the Portland police, and the activists who are in the files came in and with an artist created some amazing ways of interpreting those files from their perspective. There was one where there was the file and there was an overlay, overlay created where the activist redacted the information and annotated it to say, this is what I was doing, that wasn't true. So they controlled that process rather than having a file presented to them that was redacted by somebody else.
When were those recorded? In the, those files, was it 50s, 60s?
Yeah,
70s?
sort of, yes. No, it was sort of, it was like, oh wow, I want to do some things like that. So,
One of the people here really inspirational. I feel terrible because I forgot her name, but she was designing maps and things for people who have vision impairment.
Leanna.
Using Braille. It kind of reminded me of some of the stuff at Melbourne Uni where we're trying to create alternative ways to access records that aren't based on text and a big blob of text. Because if you're working with people who might not have high levels of literacy, then how else can you visualize or communicate that information so they can actually access it in an informed way. Or children, and there's so many cool things that people have been playing around with, mapping stuff out and using geographical overlays and all sorts. But I'm sure there's I'm getting really excited, but there's so much more we could be doing.
Yes.
With I guess.
And also the capacity of the art connection to actually raise awareness and be involved with transformative things, because suddenly people see the issue in a different way, and people that you want to influence and that you want to have advocacy with. You could write a whole big report to the Royal Commission, but maybe an exhibition
makes it much more real.
focuses on these kinds of issues, because all these communities that we work with, and also communities in post-conflict societies, various communities that are marginalised, that have been oppressed, abused, there's this phenomenon of the imagined archive. In their minds, there's an archive that they imagine is somewhere out there, and it's going to tell the things that Frank and Samantha said. It's going to tell their story. It's going to explain what happened to them. It's all these kinds of things, and it doesn't exist. Even if you put together all the fragmented stuff that's out there, it's not actually going to match what they imagine it might be. But how do you actually work with people, co-design systems that might actually create in the future the imagined archive of for people, the kids now, the kind of imagined archive that the people have been in care over the last 50 years are imagining is there and isn't there.
Yeah, yeah. But you've got, I mean, I guess when if you're a child in detention, for example, or in an orphanage or whatever, I mean, how much of what you're thinking about at the time about preservation of records is relevant to when you're an adult and you've lived through that experience? It's probably very, very different.
Yeah, so how far can you feed back into the co-design? So you're working with people, we probably have very limited capacity to work with children directly. But how do you work back into that co-design, that perspective of the imagined archive of the people who've been through the experience over generations? But because when you talk to people from various different communities, they all tend to have lots of overlap in that imagined archive of the kinds, and it's connected with identity, it's connected with memory, it's connected with accountability for what's happened to them, and the kinds of things they expected there to be records and evidence for.
Well, why do they expect it? Is because they're often treated in such a bureaucratic manner, and their names, they were given numbers in some cases.
And they might not think that as a child, as Frank said, he never thought about this. But as he got older, he started to think, I want to get access to these records. They must have had records about me.
I mean, there's
no idea what he would find, and then what he did find was so different from anything that he needed.
It's almost like a kind of paradox, almost. Look at these things, because we need a system or a setup that's flexible enough that you're not going to fix the meaning of an event or a piece of information in a domineering way, but you need stability. So how on earth do you design a system where you can present all these multiple points of view and have enough flexibility for people to shape it in the way they need it, and still have a system that's interoperable and will work with all the different institutions and other organisations that they come into contact?
There's the bureaucratic side of things. You say, that's why there should be records, but there's also the, well, I'm a kid, don't you record things about when I'm growing up as a kid? Like, that's just what happened. One interesting representation, which I might point you to, of memory and stuff like that, is there's a video game called Gone Home, which Elliot can talk a lot about as well. But it's an amazing game, and it's not a typical game experience. You kind of get to a house and it's empty, but there's the remnants of.
It's your old house.
It's your old
house. You're a person who went away to college, and then you come home. And no one's home. So you're just going through your old house you haven't been to for days and days. You start to uncover a narrative about what happened while you were away. It's a really, really interesting piece. It's a kind of a very artistic game as opposed to other games. It's quite refreshing in the current game space.
That sounds
definitely check it out.
And the whole game approach as well too. It's like, because it is. I mean, that's what Kelly was talk about. How it is revelatory reading their files, because it brings back memories that, and I find it too when I look at my own records, like you've forgotten things and suddenly you remind, oh, so and so, my goodness, where are they now? And it's that sort of, it's that process, which in the case of care leaver, that can actually be traumatising as well too, because you're remembering traumatic experiences. But then it also can be liberating, because it's validating those experiences, and it's not that. I read something where someone said, in accessing their file, it just meant that the stories they told were validated because they were there. There was evidence, and they'd been told, oh no, that couldn't have happened to you. No, surely that's not the case. And here was the file saying, no, this is what happened to me. So it was really validating of their experience at the same time as being. I mean, that's the thing with records. They can harm and heal at the same time. It's like they're so complex, and so we need systems that can actually deal with that, because we've actually built frameworks that pretend that's not the case.
Constructing those narratives. It's really
And yeah, the game's really good because I mean there's explicit things about the narrative that come out, there's implicit things, and then there's also the things that you, just your own worldview that you're putting on things, is piecing these things together in a particular way. So it's a really an interesting way that it kind of ties in, because it's this collection of things that you're unraveling.
Yes, because that whole game approach, so for the kind of the near care leaver, the experience of someone who's left care and wanting to go back and make sense in sort of their early 20s, then a game-based approach could be a way of actually helping that process. It's like,
could you even have a game style repository on this for a child? So this is your whatever, your space that you build, and then you can put in your space what you want, playing the game, or you can put stuff in.
Because it's the thing about records for children is actually the record keeping as well. I guess I've sort of thought about my own experiences and thinking about how it's the stories my mum told me when we pulled out the photographs that were as important as the photographs. And so it's that a game is actually a way, it's not that you just put things away and just continually putting things away, but that you're interacting with them. It's the process, and that's helping you feel that sense of identity, that sense of connectedness at a time when you're disconnected, you're being moved from pillar to post, from family to family situation in some cases. So that can actually be part of giving you that sense of an anchor point, by not just the records, but by the processes that you engage with the archive as well too. So it's the interfaces to the archive as much as the storage stuff itself. Yeah.
Who's doing the hard yards of digitising all these pre-electronic records? Are they only done on request, in which case everything else is just sitting there rotting away? Or is this because we're mostly talking about available electronic text or perhaps images, but what you had that picture of the, I guess it looked like a basement with lots of wooden boxes. What happened? That just stuff, does it just sit there and someone requests something and they'll get the 0.01% of it relevant to that person out? And
well, the thing is, they don't know. They don't know where it is. So, I guess the issue probably in this space is digitisation in archive tends to happen for stuff that can be made accessible. And I suppose the example is the World War I files, and service files, making them available for family history use. So I don't think there'd be many digitisation projects around these records because of the access requirements, because it is the fact that you actually have to, that file is just relevant to that person. So, but there is if there was a digitisation process, you would be hopeful that it would also, it has to go beyond that and deal with the access issues around it.
I think it's like ancestry.org driving much stuff. Like, I mean, I know the cases that you're talking about are much more sensitive, right? So I completely understand that. But the fact now that you've got people who were never interested in delving back into their past, have access to these things, and a lot of digitisation happens in that context. And obviously, your cases have a lot more stuff wrapped around them to make it more difficult. But is that a movement that's?
Yeah, I guess we would argue that, and with Sue's thinking here, is that essentially some archival institutions have kind of sold their soul to Ancestry, and said Ancestry comes in, does the digitisation, takes the value, and then eventually they still have contracts where in a certain number of years they'll actually get access to the digital copies. But meanwhile, Ancestry is making the we actually haven't addressed, we're not being very smart in terms of business models. It's
and just looking or having a play on those sites, they often don't have the kind of contextual information that you would get in an archival situation that would really help you to make the most out of a record. Like Joanne was saying, it's digitising the item, it's also about the context, the description that goes with it, the other items that it's connected to, so you can actually make sense of it.
And I guess the problem also in the ancestry space is that people are making connections that are, they're not at the process of actually verifying that that is a real connection. It's like that's my family. It's like, well, it's not. And they might have the same surname, but there actually isn't the trace of the connection. So so the whole I think that the ancestry movement is a really interesting one because they're doing a lot of digitisation, but it's not in an open way. And it's I think.
Well, what are they digitising in particular? Parish record, marriage certificate. Oh,
Everything.
Birth, death notices. Anything. But anything that we wouldn't expect.
Yes.
I mean, what other kind of things are they digitising besides those?
No, I think it is the personal
distinct
stuff.
life moment.
Yes, they want that stuff because that's what their business model is based on, having that mine of information.
Get expanded. I mean, are they kind of looking into digitising other collections that?
No, I think they're very focused on what's the stuff that we're going to be able to make available to our community.
Like you say, it's probably not in their interest,
No.
What people
different
pay
interests.
for.
And then there's also the you can't just make every kind of record publicly or on the internet. So
I just wondered if they were amassing some things that they hold on to for much later date.
They might be.
They might be.
That's a good question.
Yes, one would have to ask. Under freedom of information, we could ask to see the contracts. I think.
So they'll get to see. They are doing stuff, quite old stuff. So a key thing in a country like Australia, where so many people over so many years have migrated here, are the shipping lists. So they've got, you can look up the shipping lists of everybody who's come to Australia until 30 years ago or something. I don't think as yet they're putting out there the flight manifesto of the aeroplanes. I don't think they're there yet, but they will be. They're the kinds of things that you get all of that history in of people moving in and out.
I mean, do they go into prison? I don't know much. I haven't gone through there. I know who my family is. But do they go through prison records and things like that at Ancestry? I mean, it doesn't.
They do have prison records and asylum records.
Every now and then they will do a new archive as well. Like, so Catherine does a bit as well, and every now and then she'll get an alert to say, oh, this new set of things has been digitised and there's a name has popped up that we think might be related. So sometimes they do things just by virtue of the date, like they now have access. Other times records are set.
And that's actually that point of alerting to new actually what we need from our systems, because currently now, as these indexing projects reveal new records, onus on the person to keep on going back and asking, have you got more stuff, have you got more stuff? But we need a framework which actually does what Ancestry does and says, guess what, we have finally got around to indexing some of those ward records and done it in a way that makes them accessible and let you know, rather than buy another freedom of information.
And it also does things well, like if somebody else who might be doing your path puts kind of draws a connection, like now that my family side's kind of in the mix, it's interesting. She gets a little alert to say, oh, my great uncle or something has just made this connection. Is that the same as what is going on your side of things? So you actually get this mass community.
I remember having a brief discussion with one of the next project up there, Who Am I, about group photos of children. So like if you have a school photo, for example, there's multiple people in your photo. Do you redact all the other people's faces if someone requests that photo because they're in it, or do you run around and get permission from every single other person in that photo? Like how do you deal with those records that
we're over time. But please join me in thanking Joanne very much for that presentation and a really interesting discussion.
Programmers, technologists, archivists, social workers, please see me.